What happens when three separate governments in different regions decide at the same moment that American military aircraft are no longer welcome in their skies, effectively ending more than 70 years of assumed air dominance? Early this morning at exactly 8:47, Venezuela's Defense Minister Vladimir Pedrino Lopez signed Decree 0847, officially closing Venezuelan airspace to all U.S. military and reconnaissance flights. Within 18 hours, Cuba mirrored the decision, issuing an identical restriction shortly after Iran announced the deployment of 4 warships to international waters near Venezuela's coast. This sequence was not random, and it was not the result of coincidence or parallel thinking. What we are seeing is deliberate coordination, a synchronized military move designed to shut down surveillance corridors that the United States has treated as guaranteed since the early Cold War. For the first time in modern history, 3 nations have simultaneously activated advanced air defense systems, reinforced by sophisticated anti-access capabilities, with the explicit purpose of challenging American air superiority in strategically sensitive regions. I have spent over a decade analyzing security and power structures in emerging markets, including 11 years working on security architecture at the IMF, and I have seen many challenges to U.S. dominance in the air. There have been moments that hinted at limits to American freedom of operation, such as China forcing the landing of a U.S. EP-3 reconnaissance plane on Hainan Island in 2001, or Bolivia diverting the aircraft of President Evo Morales in 2013 over suspicions of American surveillance. Yet none of those events compare to what is unfolding now. Never before have 3 countries acting in concert closed their airspace to the United States while simultaneously backing that decision with modern layered air defense systems. The scope of this action is extraordinary. Venezuela has positioned 12 Russian-made S-300VM missile batteries across 6 strategic locations. Each system can track up to 100 targets at the same time and engage them at distances reaching 200 kilometers. Cuba has activated 4 Russian resonance radar installations capable of detecting American stealth aircraft from as far as 400 kilometers away. Iran, for its part, has deployed its domestically produced Bavar 373 air defense systems, which are widely assessed to offer capabilities comparable to Russia's S-400. Together, these deployments form a denial network spanning roughly 5 million square kilometers of critical airspace. This fundamentally reshapes the surveillance environment that has underpinned American dominance in the Western Hemisphere since the early years of the Cold War. Long-standing Pentagon assumptions that U.S. aircraft could operate with relative freedom in or near international airspace close to sensitive targets are now collapsing in real time. This shift did not emerge in a vacuum. It is rooted in decades of American airspace violations that gradually built the conditions for a unified response. During the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, U.S. U-2 spy planes conducted more than 400 unauthorized flights over Cuban territory. On October 27 of that year, one of those aircraft was shot down, killing pilot Rudolph Anderson. Despite this, the United States never issued an apology for what Havana viewed as systematic violations of its sovereignty. In 1988, the pattern repeated in another region. The U.S. Navy shot down Iran, Air Flight 655 over the Persian Gulf, killing all 290 civilians on board, including 66 children. The USS Vincennes fired 2 missiles from international waters while the commercial aircraft was on a normal ascent along its scheduled route. Rather than facing consequences, the ship's captain, William Rogers, later received the Legion of Merit, reinforcing perceptions that American accountability for civilian casualties was limited at best. In Venezuela, airspace violations became routine under the justification of counter-narcotics operations. In 2001, Venezuelan fighter jets intercepted an unauthorized U.S. reconnaissance aircraft over Zulia province, prompting President Hugo Chavez to file formal complaints with the Organization of American States. Venezuela released radar data showing the aircraft had flown deliberate reconnaissance patterns for 42 minutes before interception. The full scale of U.S. surveillance was further exposed in 2008 when U.S. Southern Command acknowledged conducting at least 17 unmanned reconnaissance missions over Venezuelan territory between 2004 and 2007. RQ-4 Global Hawk drones were used to monitor Venezuelan military facilities, including air bases and ports receiving Russian weapons, all without legal authorization from Caracas. Iran's own experience reached a breaking point in 2011 when Iranian forces captured a U.S. RQ-170 Sentinel stealth drone that had crossed into Iranian airspace from Afghanistan. When Washington demanded the return of the aircraft and its classified technology, Iran refused and instead displayed it on national television. Through reverse engineering, Tehran developed the Shahed 171, its first stealth-capable combat drone, which has since been exported to Russia, Venezuela, and Cuba. These experiences explain why the current air defense deployments represent more than routine upgrades. They mark a decisive leap in anti-access technology. Venezuela's S-300 VM systems can engage targets at altitudes approaching 100 kilometers while tracking multiple threats simultaneously. Cuba's resonance radar network dramatically extends early warning capabilities, making U.S. aircraft visible at distances that were previously unthinkable. Iran's Bavar 373 demonstrates a level of technological independence that removes reliance on foreign suppliers for core defense systems. Together, these capabilities form the backbone of a coordinated strategy that directly challenges the foundations of American surveillance power. The reaction inside Washington reveals just how disruptive this coordinated move has been. Within 24 hours of the announcements, Defense Deputy Secretary Colin Kahl convened 2 emergency meetings to explore ways of restoring American reconnaissance capabilities without provoking aircraft shootdowns. Every option placed on the table was ultimately rejected, not because of a lack of intent, but because technological and political constraints made each proposal either ineffective or dangerously escalatory. This outcome alone demonstrates how successful the coordinated air denial strategy has been. The first option involved increasing flight altitudes while remaining in neighboring international airspace, a tactic long used to reduce risk while maintaining surveillance coverage. That idea collapsed quickly when analysts confirmed that Russian radar systems deployed in Venezuela are capable of tracking aircraft at altitudes up to 50 kilometers, rendering altitude adjustments meaningless. The second proposal focused on expanding the use of reconnaissance satellites to compensate for the loss of aerial platforms. On paper, this appeared viable, but the financial and operational realities made it impractical. Each satellite launch costs approximately $300 million, and orbital paths are predictable, allowing targets to adjust activities to avoid observation. The third option considered deploying maritime reconnaissance aircraft from U.S. aircraft carriers operating in the Caribbean. That plan was abandoned almost immediately after Iran warned that increased American military presence near Venezuela could trigger a response in the Strait of Hormuz. This moment underscored a critical shift in strategic thinking. Coordinated resistance does not operate in isolation. Pressure applied in one region can generate consequences in another, forcing American planners to consider global escalation risks tied to regional decisions. Diplomatic efforts fared no better. Secretary of State Antony Blinken attempted to defuse the situation through negotiation, offering a partial easing of petroleum sanctions on Venezuela in exchange for reversing the airspace closure. The response from Venezuelan Foreign Minister Ivan Gil arrived within 2 hours and left no room for interpretation. Venezuela, he said, would not trade territorial sovereignty for market access. The message was direct and symbolic. Economic incentives and coercive pressure, tools that Washington has relied on for decades, no longer guarantee compliance. This rejection exposed a deeper strategic dilemma for the United States. Venezuela, Cuba, and Iran collectively control surveillance routes that are essential to multiple American objectives. Venezuela sits astride reconnaissance corridors used to monitor drug trafficking from Colombia into the Caribbean. Cuba dominates oversight of the Florida Straits, through which roughly 40% of U.S. maritime trade passes. Iran, meanwhile, holds influence over the Strait of Hormuz, a choke point for nearly 80% of Persian Gulf oil exports bound for Asian markets. The economic consequences of losing access to these surveillance routes are immediate and significant. Since 2001, the United States has invested approximately $140 billion in global air surveillance infrastructure, built on the assumption that access to airspace near strategic targets would remain largely unrestricted. The loss of Venezuelan airspace alone is projected to cost U.S. Southern Command an additional $700 million annually to maintain comparable coverage. Each mission now requires 43% more fuel, along with extensive aerial refueling support, sharply increasing operational strain. Attempts to establish alternative surveillance arrangements have failed one after another. Colombia declined U.S. requests to host expanded reconnaissance operations aimed at Venezuela, citing new defense agreements with Mexico that prohibit hosting actions against other Latin American states. Brazil continues to uphold constitutional bans on foreign military bases under all circumstances. Guyana briefly entertained American offers of advanced air defense technology in exchange for reconnaissance permissions, but suspended talks after Venezuela signaled it would activate territorial claims over the Essequibo region. Regional political dynamics have shifted as well. A resolution at the Organization of American States condemning Venezuela's airspace closure as a violation of freedom of navigation failed when 18 Latin American countries voted against the U.S. position. Even long-standing American partners showed hesitation, increasingly viewing such surveillance activities as infringements on regional sovereignty rather than legitimate security measures. Washington's threats of secondary sanctions against countries supplying air defense systems to Venezuela, Cuba, and Iran also fell flat. Russia and China ignored the warnings and announced $4 billion in new arms contracts with the three states. This development illustrates how alternative suppliers have eroded the leverage that sanctions once provided over military technology transfers. To understand why this coordinated response emerged and why American countermeasures have struggled, it helps to look at the broader strategic framework. Major powers seek to maximize relative strength by controlling nearby regions, but when a hegemon extends its military commitments across multiple theaters while facing challenges closer to home, it exposes vulnerabilities. The United States maintains extensive obligations in Europe, East Asia, and the Middle East, yet lacks the concentrated resources needed to decisively restore air superiority in the Western Hemisphere without sacrificing commitments elsewhere. This imbalance creates opportunities for coordinated resistance that would be far less feasible if American power were regionally concentrated. Classical international relations theory helps explain why countries with different ideologies and regional priorities have found common cause in this moment. Kenneth Waltz's balancing theory argues that when one state accumulates excessive power, others respond by forming coalitions based on shared security concerns rather than shared values. Venezuela, Cuba, and Iran fit this pattern precisely. Despite their differences, all three perceive the United States as an existential threat to their sovereignty. Coordination in this context is not ideological alignment, but strategic survival. This logic becomes even clearer when examining the foundations of American air supremacy and how they have begun to erode. For decades, U.S. dominance rested on two interlocking pillars. The first was global reconnaissance superiority, achieved through a combination of satellites, manned aircraft, and unmanned systems capable of observing nearly any location on Earth. This system depended on relatively open access to international airspace near sensitive targets. By deploying air defense systems capable of engaging non-stealth aircraft within 200 kilometers, Venezuela, Cuba, and Iran have effectively closed that access. Replacing this capability with a fully stealth-based reconnaissance fleet would require platforms like the RQ-180, each costing roughly $400 million. At that price point, comprehensive replacement becomes financially unrealistic. The second pillar of American dominance was deterrence through persistent presence. The assumption was simple. Regional powers would hesitate to take actions Washington opposed if they knew American surveillance was constant and unavoidable. The coordinated airspace closures undermine that assumption by demonstrating they can deny U.S. air access without immediate retaliation. These states weaken the deterrent effect that persistent monitoring once provided. When surveillance is no longer guaranteed, the strategic calculus changes. The ripple effects are already visible. Other countries facing pressure from Washington are exploring similar strategies. Algeria has entered negotiations to acquire Russian S-400 systems, Pakistan is considering China's HQ-9 air defense platform. Nicaragua has formally requested Russian Pantsir S-1 systems. Each of these states is watching the Venezuelan model closely, calculating that access denial technology, combined with regional or cross-regional coordination, can protect sovereignty even against a vastly superior military power. This emerging pattern reflects a broader shift in how middle powers approach relationships with dominant states. Rather than relying on accommodation or limited compliance, they are increasingly prepared to pursue active resistance when viable defensive options exist. The financial implications of this shift extend far beyond individual surveillance missions. If multiple regions adopt effective anti-access strategies and coordinate their responses, the cumulative cost of maintaining global surveillance and deterrence may exceed what even the world's largest defense budget can sustain. Technological change plays a central role in this transformation. Advances in radar, surface-to-air missile systems, and electronic warfare have narrowed the gap between offensive and defensive capabilities. Persistent surveillance, once a low-risk activity for advanced air forces, is becoming increasingly dangerous and expensive. These developments also pose serious challenges for alliance management. Within NATO, European partners must balance concerns about escalation with expectations that the United States can still deliver credible security guarantees. If American air superiority continues to face effective denial strategies in multiple theaters, allies may begin to question whether surveillance-dependent commitments remain reliable. The implications are not limited to military planning. Information warfare is an integral part of this moment. The coordinated airspace closures send messages to multiple audiences simultaneously, to American strategists, to governments considering similar actions, to domestic populations in Venezuela, Cuba, and Iran, and to neutral states evaluating the costs and benefits of resistance. Each audience interprets the move as evidence that coordinated defense can blunt even the most established forms of power projection. Beyond individual national decisions, what is taking shape is a broader regional transformation. Venezuela, Cuba, and Iran, supported by Russian and Chinese military technology, are contributing to the emergence of alternative security architectures that operate independently of U.S.-led systems. These arrangements prioritize collective defense and access denial over integration into existing Western frameworks. The significance of this shift cannot be overstated. It suggests that control over airspace and surveillance is no longer the exclusive domain of a single hegemon, but a contested space where coordination and technology can offset disparities in raw power. What Venezuela, Cuba, and Iran have demonstrated goes far beyond symbolic defiance of Washington. They have shown, in practical terms, that states with limited economic resources can still defend real territorial sovereignty when they acquire the right defensive technology and align strategically with others facing similar pressure. This moment signals a deeper transformation in global power behavior. The Pentagon has not publicly acknowledged that worldwide American air supremacy is becoming financially and technologically unsustainable, yet the evidence suggests that this transition is already underway. The foundations of air power are being reorganized quietly, not through large-scale wars, but through calculated decisions to invest in defensive systems and coordinate internationally. What once required massive offensive capability can now be challenged by layered air defenses, advanced radar, and electronic warfare working in concert. The financial strain of this shift is substantial. As more countries adopt access denial strategies, the cost of maintaining surveillance and deterrence rises sharply. Each denied air corridor forces the United States to rely on longer flight paths, additional refueling, and more complex logistics, multiplying expenses without guaranteeing success. Over time, these costs accumulate across regions, stretching budgets and reducing flexibility. This pressure raises fundamental questions about the long-term sustainability of a global military posture built on constant monitoring and rapid response. When surveillance becomes risky and unpredictable, the strategic advantage it once provided begins to erode. Technological diffusion accelerates this process. Systems that were once limited to a handful of advanced militaries are now accessible to middle powers through domestic development or alternative suppliers. Radar systems capable of detecting stealth aircraft, long-range surface-to-air missiles, and integrated command networks have reached levels of sophistication that challenge even the most advanced air forces. Defensive technology, by its nature, favors the actor protecting its own territory, allowing smaller states to impose disproportionate costs on any intruder. This dynamic reshapes the balance between offense and defense, making persistent aerial presence a liability rather than an advantage. The consequences extend into alliance politics. NATO partners, already divided over priorities and escalation risks, must now confront the possibility that American air superiority can no longer be assumed in every theater. Security guarantees that depend on surveillance and rapid intervention may appear less credible when access can be denied by coordinated defenses. This uncertainty could encourage allies to hedge their positions, invest more heavily in their own defenses, or seek alternative arrangements that reduce dependence on U.S. capabilities. The ripple effects of these calculations may alter alliance cohesion over time. Information warfare plays a parallel role in reinforcing this shift. The coordinated closures are not only operational moves, but strategic signals. They communicate to domestic audiences that sovereignty can be defended, to regional neighbors that resistance is feasible, and to distant observers that American dominance has limits. This signaling effect amplifies the impact of the military action itself, encouraging others to study and potentially replicate the model. As narratives of successful resistance spread, the psychological component of deterrence shifts away from unquestioned U.S. superiority toward a more contested perception of power. At a systemic level, the coordination among Venezuela, Cuba, and Iran reflects the emergence of alternative security networks that operate outside traditional Western institutions. Backed by Russian and Chinese technology, these arrangements prioritize mutual support against perceived hegemonic pressure. They do not require formal alliances or shared ideology, only a common assessment of threat and a willingness to cooperate. This flexibility makes such networks harder to disrupt and more adaptable to changing circumstances. Over time, they may become enduring features of the international system rather than temporary responses to specific crises. The implications of this shift reach far beyond the immediate loss of surveillance access. They point to a structural change in how power is exercised and contested in the international system. For decades, American air dominance rested on the belief that no combination of regional actors could effectively challenge its ability to observe, deter, and, if necessary, strike. What the coordinated actions of Venezuela, Cuba, and Iran reveal is that this belief no longer holds. By denying air access without provoking direct military retaliation, these states have exposed the limits of a strategy built on constant visibility and presence. The result is not simply a tactical setback, but a redefinition of what military superiority means in an era where defensive technology has caught up with offensive reach. The demonstration effect is already unfolding. Countries with modest defense budgets are reassessing their options, recognizing that sovereignty does not require matching a superpower aircraft for aircraft. Instead, it requires the ability to raise the cost of intrusion to unacceptable levels. This logic explains why access denial systems are becoming the centerpiece of defense planning in regions experiencing external pressure. When combined with coordination across borders, these systems create strategic dilemmas that even well-resourced military struggle to solve. The United States now faces the reality that restoring uncontested surveillance in one region could trigger responses in another, forcing trade-offs that were previously unnecessary. From a financial perspective, the challenge is equally stark. Global surveillance and deterrence are no longer marginal costs added to an already dominant position. They are becoming primary expenditures that compete directly with other defense priorities. As anti-access networks spread, maintaining the same level of global awareness demands exponentially greater investment with diminishing returns. This raises uncomfortable questions about opportunity costs and long-term sustainability. At some point, the expense of preserving a posture built for a different technological era may outweigh its strategic value. The broader lesson is not that American power has vanished, but that its form is changing. Air supremacy is no longer defined by freedom of movement alone, but by the ability to operate in contested environments where access is neither guaranteed nor cheap. For middle powers, the lesson is equally clear. Coordination, technology, and strategic patience can offset disparities in size and resources. The success of Venezuela, Cuba, and Iran lies not in defeating the United States militarily, but in reshaping the rules under which engagement occurs. As this model spreads, the international system may move toward a more fragmented but also more balanced security environment. Surveillance and reconnaissance will remain important tools, but their dominance as instruments of control will diminish. What replaces them will depend on how major powers adapt, whether through innovation, restraint, or new forms of cooperation. One thing, however, is already evident. The 72-year period of largely uncontested American hemispheric air supremacy has come to an end. The future of air power will be decided not only by those who seek to fly freely, but by those who have learned how to deny the sky itself.